welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your Battletoads versus podcasters host, Madelyn.
I'm your years-long meetings host, Emma.
I'm your it just happened on one phone call host, Madelyn. Thanks for tuning into this week's show. It's my side quest. And despite I almost took my boyfriend's suggestion of Santa Claus in video games, but then I decided there was not enough of that. So we're doing gaming crossovers, which is sort of Santa Claus is in some ways a gaming crossover.
Would you consider that a gaming crossover?
With like folk tales? Yeah, I guess you're right.
I feel like it'd have to be like a specific Santa Claus.
With like the Coca-Cola company. With Santa Claus is coming to town.
Yeah. Like with Rudolph's Santa or with,
So yeah, I mean, most of this was inspired by Emma live vlogged the Game Awards for me. I really thought it was Friday.
Well, that would only make sense, right?
I thought it was Friday and I was like, oh no, I have to be out. And Thursday, I also had to be out, but I could have been home. But instead, I was eating ramen.
I guess most award shows are on Sundays, right? The big televised ones?
Yeah, the big televised ones are usually on Sundays.
Not this one. This one, he wants everybody Jeffin' on a Thursday.
Jeff and Thursday. The Jeffs. The Jeffs are actually it's the Chicago Theater Awards, not spelled like Jeff Keighley, but Jeff. Anyway, believe it or not, on the Game Awards, in addition to any number of things, and no Imagine Dragons and all of that, there were a lot of gaming crossovers, including the one that Emma was like, oh wow, you really like, what was the thing that you were like, oh, you really like that?
Clive Final Fantasy?
Yeah, Emma was like, you really like Clive Final Fantasy. And I was like, I've got nothing against Clive Final Fantasy. I do have that downloaded on my PlayStation 5, and I haven't deleted it, thinking that I will eventually play it. Haha. But no, it was inspired by the really kind of unhinged Balatro DLC new card.
Also
pack.
featuring, in a way,
Clive
Final Fantasy.
Big night for him. But I watched that because Emma sent it to me, and was thinking about how, like, on one hand, I felt like excitement for some of it, but also sort of like nothing about it because who cares? They're just card skins. They don't actually do anything.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about crossovers in gaming in general and what makes them effective, and like both what makes them effective in general or as a commercial engine, and what crossovers are actually interesting for me. Because at first when I was prepping this, I was like, oh, I don't care about skins. Like, I don't like that doesn't really do it for me. And then I thought about Kazuma Kiryu in Super Monkey Ball, and I was like, no, I do care about skins.
Well, in terms of like, first party or second party crossovers, those are a relatively simple affair.
Yes, it is important to acknowledge the degrees of complexity at play here. There's the let us take some characters we already own and put them into some place where you wouldn't expect them crossover. And then there's the let us beg somebody else to use their mascot character and rip their head off.
Yeah. Kazuma Kiryu and the Monkeys, both owned by Sega, technically. And so you can put little Kazuma Kiryu. Also both developed by RGG, right, at this point. So
yep.
Having them make everything. So you can put them wherever you want in that case. And there's no, I imagine there is no or just a little bit of legalese involved in that.
Well, there's definitely, if not legalese, as we'll discover as we talk about a lot of those, and as is like so memeable about Kiryu, right? The rule for Kiryu is he can't punch a woman. Right. So while there might not be legalese, there might certainly be brand guidelines, internal brand guidelines about what these characters are allowed to do.
That's probably why he's not allowed in Tekken.
Yeah, no, exactly. It is, because he can't do it.
Yep. Even if there are women who will punch him back, he cannot do it.
As seen in Yakuza Like a Dragon 7. I wonder if he punches any women in the TV show. Anyway, I do want to, give the Madelyn history report before we jump into some case studies here, which is from what I was able to determine from my research, the very first ever gaming crossover was in Konami YY World in 1998, which was like, I couldn't even really figure out exactly really what this game was. Some levels, some different characters to play as, maybe some platform. I don't know. You make your way through some levels, but it featured Simon Belmont from Castlevania, featured a character Mikey from the Goonies, and it featured King Kong. King Kong is hard to even think of for me as King Kong feels like a folkloric character, but I recognize that's not, that he's a movie character.
He's kind of what makes something a folkloric character,
You're right. I meant, of course, we can get into the, the theory of it all here. You're right. Perhaps King Kong has passed into folklore, but he's owned by someone. Okay. It doesn't feel like someone should be able to own the concept of big monkey, but here we are.
Well, I do wonder, actually, what would count as copyright infringement for King Kong. I feel like it can't just be you have a big monkey. Surely Rise of the Planet of the Apes has had a big monkey at some point, right?
Probably. That would be an insane crossover. Just saying.
Yeah.
That would be a big get. So that's the earliest crossovers, and for a long time, and still, the crossover is really the bread and butter of the fighting game industry. Everybody wants to have that answer of, could Goku take down whoever? I didn't want to spark debate in the listeners. If I posed an actual could Goku take down X question here, they'd spend the entire time thinking about that and not listening to us talk.
Just, I would too,
I did particularly like another early one was Double Dragon and Battletoads crossover, which there's a really good photo that I think is basically me and Emma recording the podcast. A good graphic. I don't know if you feel like you're the Double Dragon guy or the Battletoad.
Yeah, I was wondering which one's the Toad.
I think I'm the Toad.
Double Dragon also got a new game announced at the Game Awards.
Yeah.
Not with the Battletoads, though.
Yet.
Unfortunately. Yet. Yeah, you're right.
But it wouldn't be a crossovers episode if we didn't talk about everyone's favorite story in the crossovers world. Kingdom Hearts.
It's amazing that Kingdom Hearts has a story since it was invented before narrative was invented.
No, I don't mean the story of Kingdom Hearts. That's impossible.
You just mean the real life elevator
the real life
story.
Lore. It's clear. Look, it's clear to anyone who has played Kingdom Hearts that Kingdom Hearts does not begin to have a story until, the late 2010s or so.
Sure, you're right. Yeah, so the popular story is that Hashimoto of Square Enix, they shared a building with Disney in Japan at the time, some branch of Disney, and he ran into a representative in an elevator and said, "Why don't we make a game together?" And at the same time, Nomura, who had been working on Final Fantasy 7 and 8, was very inspired by Super Mario 64, the first real 3D platformer to come out, wanting to make a 3D environment type game. And someone was saying yeah, but we couldn't do that with original characters. We need someone as iconic as Mario, like Disney characters or something. And these two things eventually clashed together and were like, all right, we're making a 3D game with Disney characters, but essentially with a story like Final Fantasy, coming from the Square Enix side. There is a great Iwata Asks interview.
Oh, Iwata gets it.
There's a great Iwata Asks interview that's now archived with Nomura. That's Nomura keeps recounting how he kept going to Disney to pitch things, and the first time they went, they had a bunch of ideas they wanted them to do,
and he was Chainsaw Sora.
No, he said he like interrupted them halfway through and was like, "No, I don't want to make those types of games. This is the type of game I want to make." And he keeps talking about how, like, through the first early meetings, very often they would, like, go into, like, a tizzy a little bit. But he was like, but it was all in English, so I couldn't understand any of it, so I just kept going.
Remember, this man is very quiet, but very powerful.
He really is. He was recounting, like, yeah, I brought my original design for Sora, which, if you haven't seen it, is, like, he used to be, like, a lion type, like, with a tail and ears, and he had a chainsaw type sword. And he showed this, and they were like, what is this? Chainsaw?
Chainblade.
They were like, we can't do that. They looked shocked, absolutely speechless. He said they were looking at the design document, probably saying, this is terrible, and so on. It was all in English, though, so I didn't understand a word.
It's Nomura's choice to not learn how to speak English, really, like, serving him well.
I know, it's really, like, the power of things being lost in translation to just, like, force your ideas across, I guess.
Yeah.
But apparently the key for working with Disney is to just, like, run into somebody somewhere and, like, pitch it. Because that's apparently how Sora ended up in Smash Bros. In the end, eventually, too. That Sakurai was just at an event with a Disney person and was like, how about putting Sora in Smash? And that's how they managed to get that started and going.
That's gotta be such a lie. I don't believe for a second that Sakurai, like, he was at that event with the sole purpose of, having watched that man's, like, How I Did My YouTube channel, there's no way that he had not set up a chain of events that led to that exact moment.
I mean, maybe. But it is really just, like, you have to engineer a meeting with somebody, like, in person.
Well, and Nomura talks later in the Iwata Asks interview, too, about how, like, all the time there were people at Disney being like, I don't know about that. Like, I don't think you should do that. But, like, he would talk to the president, and the president would be like, that's fine.
Yeah.
So you just got to go up the chain. I didn't realize, it's, sorry, I promise I'm not just going to talk about Kingdom Hearts. I promise.
It's a very significant crossover game.
It is the significant crossover game.
Maybe behind Super Smash at this point.
Sure. You're right.
Yeah.
But it really does underscore for me how we, like, just missed the marvel of 3D games. Does that make sense to me? Kingdom Hearts, having played it as, like, a 7-year-old, right? Yeah. Experienced it as a 7-year-old, does not come across to me as remarkable in any way. Does that make sense? It's like, oh, Disney and Final Fantasy? I don't know what the heck Final Fantasy is. But, like, Disney and Final Fantasy, that's, like, whatever. Like, of course. And they're in 3D and it's an action game? Whatever. Of course. Whereas when you, like, look at this historically, and when you hear Nomura being like, this was inspired by Mario 64... which I had not heard before. I feel like I've read this interview and I just didn't remember that. That's crazy because I don't think of those two games as being historically related to each other in that way.
Yeah, I mean, Mario 64 really just was the advent of people making games in 3D spaces. But right. yeah, you don't think of them together.
It does also raise more vividly the possibility of an alternate universe where they worked in the same... Imagine if Square Enix and Nintendo were in the same building, actually. That would be insane. But, like, there'd be a lot of, like, pranks happening. But the idea of that, like, if Kingdom Hearts had been Mario instead of...
I think it would have been a very different game, you know?
I don't.
You don't?
I think it would be the same.
He might have gotten the chainsaw, you know?
He might have gotten the chainsaw. His party would be, like, Luigi and... Toad.
Oh God. You're right though. You've got to have the one party member that has an unintelligible voice.
That's correct.
No matter the timeline.
Yeah. But of course Kingdom Hearts is in so many ways. It's really funny that they insist on continuing to tell the story of, like, we met in an elevator, because it just doesn't feel like, is there even a kernel of truth in that story?
I think it's absolutely true.
Sure.
Not like, oh, they shook hands and signed the deal right in that elevator. I think they probably just exchanged business cards and then followed up on it, right?
Yeah.
But it does really feel like And in all the other crossover stories I read, a lot of them are like, well, I just talked to this person and it sort of went from there, right? I got a chance to speak to this person and then we continued,
It's
And
so
so I think
interesting.
that's what it is.
It's interesting though because I put different degrees of credence behind some of those stories, right? I believe that any of the Balatro cards that were announced at the Game Awards was just like they were like, "Yo, Cult of the Lamb guys, like want to be a Balatro card?" And they were like, "Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely."
Yeah.
Like I believe that works that way. When I read that the Fortnite and Marvel people for the Thanos crossover, they're like, it started as a simple phone conversation. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. That's a lie.
See, what I believe is that, yes, most of these things start as a simple conversation. I bet there's a lot of simple conversations that then do not get followed up on whatsoever, or are immediately shut down afterwards. But I do believe that the concept comes from a lot of simple conversations.
On one hand, yes. On the other hand, the idea that like the beginning of a collab between Epic and Marvel was like there have to be so many steps to get to a simple phone call there. That's all I mean. Yeah. And so many of these crossover stories, like all of these crossover narratives insist on this story for the most part. There's only a few. It's notable when anyone talks about actually there was a lot of contractual back and forth and this was like really hard. And slowed us down. Like one of the only ones I feel like we saw in our research, what was it? It was Larian, with the Dead Cells. That's not Larian. That's what I mean. Konami. I don't know why I said Larian. Lolly.
Larian Castlevania would be interesting.
That'd be sick. But no, the Dead Cells Castlevania collab is like one of the very few ones where anyone seemed to be willing to talk about. We actually thought this was going to come out at this point. And it took so long for us to nail this down that...
But even that story, like, the start is like, oh, we were looking for a publishing partner, like, for Japan, I think. And Konami was one of those. And the guy was just like, what if I asked, could we put an Alucard costume in Dead Cells while I was there? While I happened to be talking to these guys. And they were like, yeah, sure. And then they took that and were like, actually, what if we made a whole DLC pitch? And then went back to them. And they were still like, yeah, sure, right? But you do have to... The legal stuff is just not very exciting to talk about, right?
I want to hear more about the legal stuff. I'm excited to hear about it.
Yeah, like... back to Kingdom Hearts, there's the famous story of like, oh, you can only use Mickey Mouse in very certain ways, right?
Once.
Like his silhouette.
Isn't that insane? It's kind of insane when you think about it, right? I know Mickey is the mascot character, but there are so many beloved characters in Kingdom Hearts that are allowed to do wild things.
Well, what I would love in Kingdom Hearts 4 is if they just use Steamboat Willie Mickey insanely. No nor need for permission on that one.
Can you imagine? Like Nomura walks in, here it is. They're like, what's happening? Like, Steamboat Willie just ripped out a man's throat. And he's like, you don't own that.
You don't own that anymore.
This is the game I
What do you
make.
think the copyright status is on hooded Mickey Mouse is really my question.
Seriously.
Mickey Mouse with the ear hoods.
When does he become the property of the people?
But other stuff too, like I was reading about the Mario Rabbids games, and their restrictions on Mario to Ubisoft was specifically like, don't make a platformer and don't like put an emphasis on Mario jumping, which is interesting because it's specifically like, please don't use Mario for what we use Mario for.
Yeah.
If you're gonna use Mario, make him do something that Nintendo doesn't make him do.
Which, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's a solid boundary to draw.
Yeah.
Mario vs. Rabbids, I don't know, the whole crossovers thing has made me realize how I almost feel like we missed a golden era of these feeling like anything. Does that make sense? I feel like there was a different time that has ended now where the kind of like, it's Disney and Final Fantasy, it's Marvel and Capcom, it's Mario and Sonic, right? These are all just things that I'm like, oh, of course. Or Smash has like a million characters. Of course it does. And you can kind of like marvel at some of the individual achievements there, of course. But for the most part, these kinds of crossovers are so common, at least in surface level ways, and so corporatized, and just also so, I mean, thanks Marvel, right? We live in the era of the multiverse. It's hard for me to think about like Mario and Sonic in a game together is crazy when you think about it, and you think about the history there.
Yeah.
But none of these games have ever registered that way for me, because I just wasn't the right age to appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, by the time we were aware of Sonic was in a very different position than he was during the console wars, right? So, of course, that's not going to feel as remarkable. But what did really strike me in researching this, like, I don't think there's, you talked about Marvel, but that's not really a crossover, right? That's just like characters from this. It's a first or second party crossover, I guess.
You're right.
But even the way comics have always been, there's always been like characters will show up in other places, right? So that it just strikes me how common crossovers are in games in comparison to any other media.
It's true. It's a big deal when there's any kind of, when like a TV episode does anything, right?
Yeah.
When Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD are all on one case together. It's a 3-hour event.
Right. They're doing, I don't know if they already did this, the Always Sunny in Abbott Elementary crossover.
I refuse to believe that that's real.
I just can't picture what it's like. I know it's because they're set in the same city.
Right. No, I understand it from that perspective.
But yeah, I'm like, I don't know how they're doing that. But yeah.
No, TV crossovers are rare. Like, what would a movie crossovers are rare. But I can't think of a book crossover.
Any notable theatrical crossovers ever been made? I guess like band musicals are kind of crossover
they're like a genre
flavored.
mix.
Yeah.
You can think of like Falstaff is not really a crossover, it's more like a spin-off, right? Like Falstaff appears in multiple of Shakespeare's plays, right? And then he kind of gets to be the goofy lead in Merry Wives of Windsor, right? So that's not a crossover, but it's a extended universe, right? Oh, that'd be crazy. Can you imagine if they were like, it's Wicked and Les Miserables?
Yeah. Or like doing like a Andrew Lloyd Webber multiverse, Yeah. That's not an idea. Don't take that.
Somebody take it.
Don't do it.
Somebody do it. But you're right. I mean, it's, games are sort of uniquely situated in they're focused on cosmetics, right? I think is a big part of this.
Yeah, I think that a costume DLC is like the easiest way to do a crossover, probably. You're not necessarily making use of any characters, right? You're just making use of costume designs. So I think those are really frequent, right? But even among like more substantial ones, there's a surprising number.
I guess the theatrical equivalent would be like stunt casting, right? Like Chicago has been running for 20 years or whatever, and all the time they're like, this pop star is playing Roxy Hart, this person from TikTok, right? Mm-hmm. That's a multimedia crossover. That's probably the closest that I can think of in my industry.
Yeah.
So, can't be a crossover episode without talking about Smash.
Right, of course.
I didn't even realize, again, just revealing my ignorance and age, that the first Super Smash Bros. Was only Nintendo characters. This game is now synonymous to me with third-party crossovers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just because I feel like the article you posted was talking about this, like it's hard to imagine in like the console war era, which, like, you know, there's still competition in the fact that they want you to buy their box, but is not the same as it was like in the 90s and early 2000s.
Right now, I mean, I'm going to give it a 20% chance that all these, like, this acquisitions era that we're in takes us back in that direction, but we'll see. I think.
But, I mean, it's just like so many games are on multiple consoles, even first-party games. Xbox is letting some of its games go to other consoles. Sony, of course, is putting all their games on PC now. I think the only reason you don't see, like, stuff go to Switch is because sometimes the Switch can't play it yet. So I feel like even among, like, oh, this is, like, our first-party game, it's like, but we're also letting other companies put it on their box. So there's just less ownership over franchises now, I feel like. Like with Nintendo being kind of the exception, but even then they rent out their characters to other people sometimes. So
the Solid Snake reveal, the very first like third party in Smash, is insane.
Yeah.
Just great, like really set the bar.
I didn't watch it, so.
It's like, so Snake is getting like an assignment, right?
Sure.
It's like, have you heard of Super Smash kind of assignment? And then, you know, his boss is like, where are you? And it cuts to like a box on the Super Smash field. He's like, I'm doing reconnaissance.
Right.
Know your enemy. I was like, that's insane. I actually can't imagine watching that live. I can't imagine what would hit like that.
Solid Snake is such a kind of a wild pick for their first one, too.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, it's not, if you just are thinking about, like, he's very iconic, right? There's a lot of sort of tangential but interesting interviews with Sakurai about, like, how he approaches what characters he wants to put in Smash. But, like, you know, Metal Gear is not, like, the first thing I think of, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's synonymous with Nintendo's brand image, right? Especially, yeah. You know, they're a little less, like, you know, family first
sure.
sort of image these days, but, like, it's just, like, going immediately to, like, this game about, like, war, is a little wild as a first pick.
That's why it's genius, though.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine, like, he offered a lot of options. Like, he's got that box, right? Can do a lot with that box.
You can do a lot with a box. But it's weird to imagine, like, what percentage of his time working on those games do you think Sakurai had to spend in, like, meetings with people from other companies?
You know, it's a good question. I don't know if he would need to be involved in, like, the really, like, lawyer to lawyer meetings. I feel like it's more like, okay, here's the concept for the character and the restrictions on what the licensee would want.
Or
licensor.
Well, where is the sentence ending?
Like what the company that owns the character would want.
Yeah.
So I feel like not as much as you would expect, or maybe it's not that different from design meetings. You just have more people there also, you know?
I still feel like 25% solidly.
Well, a lot of game development is meetings, so...
No, of course, but like other like internal meetings too, but I'm like, meetings with external stakeholders got to be at least 1/4 of that job.
Sure.
Which is crazy. Just, you think about all of the, like, weird things that he has to have said to people over the course of developing those games, you know? Like, we'd like to have Snake in a box. That's not that weird.
That's not that weird. That's part of his whole moveset, so.
No. I know, sorry. I'm not familiar enough with Smash to give, like, good examples here. But it does sort of feel like the sort of minutia, I'm sure, the kind of corporate minutia you must have to argue over in terms of what the character looks like or what they're allowed to do, you know,
sure, yeah.
has to get quite absurd.
Well, it depends on the company.
Of course.
For Snake specifically, every report sounds like they were very happy to lend him out.
Yeah.
To do whatever was necessary.
So here's a question for you. So we talk on the show periodically about how licensed music has, like, locked us away from a lot of games for a while. And that's finally, seems like we're kind of conquering that, right? A lot of the, like, really, we're never going to see this ever again. You know, Tony Hawk is back, right? Whatever. And now...
With less music, but yeah.
Yeah. But roll with me here. In reading about this, it made me think about, and obviously nobody talks enough about the legal setup here, so I can't really get into this the way I'd want to. But given that every game has crossovers, you know, and obviously most of them are just DLC and you just remove them from the game or whatever, but are crossover type things going to become, like, the next copyright albatross for games?
Well, I do think it's easier now, like you were saying, even if it's not DLC, but to build the game in mind of, okay, we might have to remove this at some point.
Yeah.
Versus, I think a lot of, like, the delistings you see of licensed music, it's because they can't, the game is not built for them to, like, go back in and, like, excise a song from it. So there's that, right, of, like, we're so much better at post-game updates now, right? And there's more functionality and support for that can be removed. And especially if they're just DLC, you just delist the DLC, right? You don't delist the whole game. And, you know, there's not as much, like, auto copyright bots for anything besides music. So I don't really think it'll be that much of a problem.
So part of what raised this issue for me is I was reading about the kind of rocky history of Marvel vs. Capcom, which was this sort of, like, weird symbiotic relationship that had some real ups and downs to the relationship. So originally, like, a partnership because Marvel was in a bad financial place and was like, let's license our characters so that we have any money.
Right.
And, you know, they made, like, various, like, X-Men games, and there's a couple of, like, crossover games before the first official Marvel v. Capcom. But then, like, after the release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, just, like, over and over, the history is like, well, Marvel pulled the rights, and then they changed their mind, and then Disney acquired Marvel, and they pulled the rights, but then they changed their mind. You know, it's like they pulled the rights after Marvel vs. Capcom 2 because they didn't feel like there was a market for this, and then there was a resurgence of these kind of fighting games, so they made 3. And then Disney was like, we're going to do Disney Infinity, which I might talk about separately in a minute. So we want the Marvel characters for that. But then Disney Infinity self-destructed, and they were like, okay, make another one. And it's just like, oof, the dangers of putting your eggs in this basket.
Sure. I do think, you know, on a series level,
yeah,
yes, eventually that partnership might dry up or go sour or whatever. It's
but
just
they had
like,
to delist some of the games. Some of the games got delisted because they didn't have the rights anymore. And you're right, of course, on a series level, different than on a, like, individual DLC level. But I just thought it was interesting, and I wonder what the legal fine print of it is.
We did talk about that one game I cannot remember which one it was anymore, but had like Spider-Man in it.
Oh,
without
yeah.
permission. What game was that? Do you remember?
I remember there being a game that has Spider-Man in it, and then they were like, no. It was one of the fighting games.
Was it a fighting game? Because he was like a boss. He wasn't like a...
Man, I can't remember. I remember this, though. That, yeah, it was Spider-Man, and then they were like, it's not Spider-Man
and like
anymore.
in the second printing, they had to change it to like
Spider-Man.
A guy who was Spider Guy. So you get stuff like that, too.
Definitely.
You couldn't do that these days, I feel like.
I know. I do feel like there was a lot more wiggle room for kind of like, haha, it's not this, wink, wink, 20 years ago than there is now.
I think you could probably do that within your own company, but not like, whoops, we put Spider-Man in here.
Well, but even within your own company, it can be really hard. So I read all about kind of the downfall of Disney Infinity, right? Which was this like kind of within Disney crossover series based on, this was so big in the 2010s, right? The like, you've got your little figurine guy, and like you buy your little toy, and then you get to play him in the game. Genius. Money to be made. Can't fault them.
Nintendo's still making money from that.
Nintendo's still making money. But, you know, as they were like continuing to want to expand Disney Infinity 2, well, first of all, they got screwed by being like, everybody loved this. We didn't have enough figurines, so we have to print more figurines. And then nobody wanted that many, and the expense of making all of those figurines dragged down the game.
Right.
Which is kind of crazy. But even more relevant to what we're talking about here was, so like Disney owns other companies, right? Like Marvel, like Lucasfilm, who are involved in some of their most recognizable, most toy sales generating IP, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so like a big issue that really kind of brought down the company, or brought down the project, hastened it to its end.
If only.
Was that, what?
If only it brought down the company.
But like these other stakeholders were like, well, you know, if you want to do Guardians of the Galaxy, you got to have everybody, and you got to make toys for everybody, right? And that's rough, because then you've spent that money on those toys that people aren't going to buy, and that's stuck on your budget, but you didn't even want them in the first place. Or like there was something with, I copy pasted the same thing twice here instead of something new, but there was something with Lucasfilm too, where like the developers really wanted to focus on on like the new movies coming out, like The Force Awakens or whatever, but Lucasfilm was like, no, like you've also got to do the stuff from like the TV show that we're doing right now. And so because they had all these stakeholders, even just like within subsidiaries of a company, that they had to please, it brought down the whole project, because they just had to keep saying yes to things that actually weren't good business decisions in order to get the things that they wanted.
Sure. Yeah, something on the level of Disney, obviously, I feel like, yes, you will have problems within your own company. Something on the level of, Kiryu and Monkey Ball, maybe not.
Maybe not. But it was interesting to read about some of these like gone wrong situations, because a lot of the kind of like worst crossover lists are really focused on like this was weird, like this wasn't cool, this was kind of boring, or didn't add anything to the game. And I'm like, no, give me a list of worst crossovers that like brought down a company.
Yeah,
that's what I want to see. Give me the carnage. One of the worst crossovers, by the way, this one seemed like someone should have been like, I don't think so, early on one of these lists. The Mortal Kombat Batman one just seems like nobody thought that through.
Did we talk about this? Because we've talked about Injustice, right?
I think so.
That's NetherRealm still, right? I'm not crazy.
I don't remember.
But I think it's the same company, so like maybe that was bad, but they did make 2 Injustices.
Well, no, but so the issue with the Mortal Kombat Batman is that they toned down all the fatalities, because someone at DC was like, we can't see Batman's entrails ripped out. That's not in the brand guide. And it does sort of feel like that conversation should have happened before things at the project like were too far along to not like that should have happened in the first conversation, being like, have you played Mortal Kombat? Are you gonna be cool if we see Batman's like intestines? And when they said no, that probably should have been it. Just feels like toning down fatalities is not what the Mortal Kombat audience wants, even if you have the chance to see Batman.
But I mean, like I said, I guess that was Midway, and then they made NetherRealm, so maybe that was the problem. That was the fallout of that, right?
Yeah.
But they kept working with DC characters, is what I meant to say. So
For sure. I thought I was not doing that as an example of something that brought down the company or the partnership, just as something.
Well, it did, sort of, to be fair.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I also love discovering that there is a Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Why is that insane?
I don't know why it is. It's just, I guess it's because, again, 90% of game crossovers are somebody in a fighting game or like a skin in Fortnite or something like that.
Phoenix Wright is in, there's a Marvel vs. Capcom, I think.
That's a fighting game.
I know, I'm just saying. He's also in a fighting game.
Fair enough. But I think it's crazy when they're like, no, we're going to bring together two super detectives. That's sick. That's like, the greatest, this is not even, the greatest game crossover of all time. It's not even a games crossover. It's like a book crossover in a game. Do you know what you know what I'm going to say?
No, I don't know what you're going to say.
Games that are based on a series of books where eventually we get to meet somebody else from a different series of books. Two of them.
Oh, Nancy Drew.
Yeah, when the Hardy Boys are there?
Yeah.
Heck yeah. That's the stuff. The Hardy Boys show up. Ooh. I was trying to think like, are there any game crossovers that I really love? And I don't have that many. I mean, obviously I love Kingdom Hearts, but I don't think of it that way. I don't love it as a crossover.
That's a book cross. That reminded me of like when they unofficial Sherlock Holmes crossed with Lupin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The originator of Sherlock Holmes, right?
Exactly. Sherlock Holmes. But yeah, I couldn't, despite proposing this episode, I don't feel like I have so many good crossovers that I'm like, oh, I love this. This really hit for me.
I just don't think the franchises that usually cross over are like ones I care about both sides of.
Right.
Especially, I mean, obviously we're very Kingdom Hearts girlies, but even then it's not like, oh yeah, that's a crossover that I want. That's just because we were poisoned as children, right?
Yeah. We
were infected by the PlayStation 2.
Yep.
But yeah, I just, I don't have a lot of brand loyalty, I guess, which is a lot of like what the crossover thing is,
You don't feel like Tokyo Mirage Sessions does anything for you in that way?
Well, it's like barely a crossover.
Yeah.
Like, I put the story on here because I thought it was interesting, because it was actually Nintendo or a director from Nintendo that initiated the conversation with Atlas, when you would usually think it would be the other way around, right? Most of the other Nintendo crossovers tends to be somebody went to Nintendo and they took an interest, right? But in this one, it was like Kaori Ando, they were working with Atlas for something called Itsumo Purikura Kuradeko Premium, whatever that is. So, but afterwards they went and was like, what if we took a Nintendo brand and Shin Megami Tensei? I read somewhere that originally started with Pokemon, but they were already making a Pokemon like tactics game, and so thought that would be too much, and so they did Fire Emblem.
What
Pokemon was crossing
Tactics
over with
game?
another series that was like a tactics game that's never been brought over to the West. I think either that game or whatever they were crossing over with. So
Sure.
But so they're like, what if we took Fire Emblem and SMT and went to Atlas with it? And Atlas was like, let us think about it. Which the Kotaku article that I read for this helpfully notes usually means no in Japan.
Isn't that a crazy thing that they have to note? Hasn't everyone in their life been like, I'm kind of busy, let me get back to you?
Which in Atlas's case was
true.
True. They were working on Devil Survivor 2. And we're just too busy for that. And so, like, a year after the initial conversation, they sent a message back being like, is this talk still open? Which I also think is how a lot of crossovers work sometimes, right? Yeah. You have that initial conversation, you put it on the back burner, and then you're like, a year later, like, knock knock. You know, we talked about this a year ago. You still open? And ended up making the Tokyo Mirage Sessions TMS, backwards of SMT, in case you. But it's like barely a crossover. Like, it uses the Fire Emblem characters, but designed quite differently, and, you know, has its own combat system and so on and so forth. It's a crossover in the sense that the companies were working together more than like, here's our characters and let us put those in a game.
So that's mid for you. I mean, it's
just like I played that and I enjoyed it, but it's not like I was like, oh yes, it's so cool, you know, crossing Fire Emblem with Joker Persona 5, right, or whatever, right? I played it because I like those kinds of games, not because it was a crossover.
It'd be cool if Joker Persona 5 came to the Academy.
Oh, be careful. Persona 5 crossover is the kiss of death for all video games.
That is true. He
will shut you down within a year or two.
Smash has been okay, but yeah.
He was one of the guest characters? You know, they stopped updating it right after like a year or two, so I'm just saying.
You're right, Smash dead. You heard it here first.
He spared Smash and went for New Horizons instead.
Right. Dead game. But I can't even think of. I remember us being sort of excited about the 2B skin in Fall Guys.
Oh yeah. Well, costumes are cute, you know.
Yeah.
I like it when there's like weird, unhinged little costumes everywhere. What is Fortnite if not a lot of people getting excited about weird, unhinged little costumes?
Yeah,
right?
It's like a little dollhouse.
It is. It very much is like a little dress-up dollhouse, right? But again, those ones are so like. I was already playing Fall Guys, right? I had already played a little bit of Fall Guys. And maybe that gets me to come back for a little bit to look at it. But like, I don't feel like I'm like, yes, you know, I'm not picking up Stellar Blade because they rented out 2B to it too. So
yeah, the costumes are a really interesting thing for me because I understand the excitement of a Marvel versus Capcom, of a even the like Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy 14 stuff, where it's like, oh, you've got people who are really passionate about one of these things, and it might be enough to draw them to the other, right? But costumes are so insubstantial so much of the time that it does sort of just feel like what's the goal here? I guess the goal is like a games media marketing bump, and it's not really about necessarily hitting your Automata fans. It's getting more people to be like, oh, Fall Guys. Yeah.
And it's pretty easy. Maybe you get less reward out of it, but it's also less effort.
I can't argue.
Not that it's no effort, right? You have to make that little costume. But something like Fall Guys probably has a pipeline for making little costumes, so.
How are there any crossovers you would want to see in your dreams? What are your dream crossovers?
Again, it's just like, I don't know. I just don't have that much, like, I feel like if there was one, it would be something I couldn't think of at all, like, at this moment, right? If there was, like, a neat crossover that I would like, it'd be something, like, very unexpected that I couldn't just come up with here. Because, like, I just don't have that kind of... I very much endeavor not to have that kind of, like, relationship with franchises, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to say, like, yes, oh wow, I would love this to cross over, I guess. What about you?
Yakuza Kingdom Hearts.
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
No question.
I do think, like, yeah, working off, like, the crossover thing that I am passionate about, like, it would be fun to just, like, open up Kingdom Hearts to, like, everything. Yeah. As much as a nightmare that would be.
Literally impossible.
But it's, like you were saying, especially in the age of, like, acquisition, where I am watching the Sony Katakawa stuff, like, oh god.
Yeah.
It's very hard to be, like, psyched about crossover things, right?
Nancy
like,
Drew,
oh
Ace
yay,
Attorney.
Disney owns X-Men now.
Yeah.
Yahoo!
Yahoo! I'd like to see Mario in more unexpected places.
I just think what would be fun is if we overhauled our copyright system.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Wouldn't that be fun?
Here's our crossover wish list. A new piece of copyright law. Only if we did that, we would just get so much evil Winnie the Pooh drivel. Like, that's the problem. It would still be probably a net good, but we would be totally swallowed by horrible, violent takes on family characters.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, it's a double-edged sword.
It's true. Have you seen the, like, Piglet's Big Game resurgence?
No.
There's, like, an old game, like, that's a little bit spooky with Piglet. It was made for Piglet's Big Movie, but has nothing to do with Piglet's Big Movie, of course, because that was the age of games being made for movie promotion.
That's a whole different age of crossovers. The, like, movie tie-in crossover game. That has nothing to do.
Right, yeah.
Give people free reign again.
Well, any last crossover thoughts?
No. I think it would be great to see. I'm waiting with bated breath for someone to find a crossover that would actually get me really excited.
Yeah. I'm not saying no to it. I don't know what it would be.
Yeah. So, bring it on, people. Give me something cool. We've given you something cool. It was another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
If you enjoyed the show, you should hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog, featuring most recently Emma's thoughts on Arcane. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Talk This so you never miss an episode on Sundays. Some games next week that we are talking about.
For our old game is Final Fight. Our new game is Dragon Age: The Veilguard.
So look forward to it.
And then will it be the week after that for your end episode, or do we want to do that on the 5th instead?
Stay tuned.
We'll
No,
see.
probably better to do it for the 28th, thinking about
29th.
holiday schedules and that sort of, or sorry, the 29th, Sunday.
Yes.
2 weeks from today.
That's Sunday.
is a Sunday. Yeah, probably better to do it then. Oh, actually, let me think about that. We'll find out.
We'll get back to you next week.
I'm like thinking about how the dates actually align. I'm like, wait a minute, let me think. So year-end podcast on one of those two things, but look forward to it. Yeah. Frightening amount of hours on a very predictable game for me. PlayStation Wrapped, thanks. Scary. Well, that's this week's show. Emma, sign us off.
This week, I hope that you cross over with happiness and peace.